Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to our first Caring for Vulnerable Children Google Hangout, which is coming to you live from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. Today, we're putting your questions to Graham McPhee, discussing the first week of the course. Please feel free to ask questions using the Google Hangout question bar, and we will do our best to pass along as many of your questions as we can. You can also post your questions on Twitter. Make sure you use the hashtag FLChildren. And now, without further ado, I will hand over to your host today, Graham McPhee.
Hello and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining me today as part of the Google Hangout on the Caring for Vulnerable Children course. So an especially warm welcome to those of you that are watching live. I recognise a lot of you won't be able to watch it live, but will watch the recording afterwards. So the next bit doesn't apply, and it's just to reiterate what Aidan said there about the ability for you to interact live with me during the session. So you can send questions to me via the Google Hangout bar or via our Twitter hashtag, which is hashtag FLChildren, and that's all one word. And I'd be really keen to get questions as I'm talking and get a bit of a dialogue going, so I'm kind of looking forward to that happening. So hope you've been enjoying the course. We're now coming up towards the end of week 2. It's been a fantastic first couple of weeks of the course. I get kind of really impressed with well, really pleased first of all with the kind of numbers of people participating, but really impressed with the level of discussion that is emerging on all different sorts of pages, both where we're asking questions and also where we're not. The material that we've been presenting has obviously been generating lots of different thoughts and ideas amongst you about the task of caring for vulnerable children, and some about issues of vulnerability and risk. And then in week 2, thinking about notions of attachment and containment. So lots of comments there, and also Billy's story. We're 2 weeks into Billy's story now, and again lots of comments and opinions about what's going on for Billy. What I hope to do over the next 30 minutes or so is respond to as many comments and questions as I can. I should also just at this point kind of put in a sick note and some apologies. Ideally, it would have been myself presenting with my colleague John Fitzpatrick today. Unfortunately, John Paul's had to submit a sick note, so he's not going to be joining us today. But you don't escape John Paul that easily. You will be seeing him. Hopefully, he'll be able to join us for the Google Hangouts later in the session. And he also does a couple of video inputs that appear in the course in weeks 4 and 6. So you will meet him later on. But I hope John Paul's doing okay. So we've had, I think I've got the figures here, but we've had over coming up on 14,000 comments posted in the first 10 or 11 days of the course. So I think it goes without saying, won't be able to respond to all of them, but I'm going to kind of pick up on some comments and questions as we go. I'm going to start with respond to a question that was asked on the Google Hangout bar, and that came from Yin Yan Chen. Thanks for your question, Yin Yan. And Yin Yan asked a question about did the course setting assume a societal setting like the current Scotland, where there's certain procedures in place for us thinking about vulnerable children, and discussion kind of stemming from that? And the simple answer to that, Yin Yan, is to some extent yes. I mean, the Billy's story is based in Scotland. A lot of the material that we consider is from a Scottish perspective. What we would hope that we can do, obviously there's a direct relevance for participants taking part in the course from Scotland because they're based there. But I think for all of us, thinking about, even if you're from outside Scotland, everybody can have learning from thinking about different systems and procedures and ways of thinking about children, childhood, vulnerability, and different perspectives that come from different countries and different cultures. So largely we're going to be focused on aspects of childcare as it plays out. And there will be some material in later weeks where we think about different theoretical and practice-based approaches that come from other parts of the world. So it won't be exclusively about Scotland. And we would hope that all of you are able to think about the issues that we are raising with regards to children, care, vulnerability, attachment, development, containment, the various kind of concepts and ideas that we're thinking about, and think about how these play out and apply in your setting. But I think it's an important question, an important thing to think about up front, because depending on how services are organised in your setting, depending on how actually children are viewed as a group in terms of what's expected of them and what's expected of the people who surround them and look after them and have responsibility for them, then that will mean that there will be different considerations for different groups of either professionals or carers in different settings. So yes, we will largely have a Scottish-based context, but we would always be encouraging participants to think about how does it apply in my setting, and how does what's going on in Scotland compare. One of the best ways to think critically about our own system and way of doing things is to compare it to systems elsewhere. So if you are from outside Scotland, think about how does what you're learning about the Scottish system compare to what exists in your own setting, and what might one system learn from the other. In week one, we presented you with a poll where we asked you, a poll of 10 very short scenarios, and asked you to identify the scenarios where you thought that the children in them were presented with the most risk and vulnerability. And we did that in week one as we were just beginning to introduce some of the concepts involved with risk and vulnerability. And now the results of that poll were posted on the page yesterday. So hopefully you've had a chance to look at it. If you haven't had a chance, if you go back into week one and go into the step where that was, you'll be able to see the results. I just want to kind of talk about some of the things that came out of the result. However, before doing that, it's probably just kind of worth kind of flagging up that this is not an exact science. What we present you with is 10 one-sentence scenarios, and obviously if any professional was attempting to carry out a proper or thorough assessment of any sort of scenario, you would need much more information. And so that wasn't what this exercise was about. We were just wanting to kind of test and tease out to a certain extent what is it that you think constitutes vulnerability and risk. Apparent straight away, if you were looking at the results, was of the 10 scenarios, 4 of the scenarios gathered a huge percentage of the votes. There was kind of 4 scenarios way ahead of all the others, and then the others coming behind with kind of far less votes. And the 3 scenarios that got the most votes, what they all had in common, or I'm assuming that this was a motivating factor in them being selected, was that those 3 scenarios, that the age of the children was very young. The scenario that got the most votes, 77%, if you highlighted this one, a tiny baby who'd been given a violent shaking by their carer, who's learning difficulties and upset because the baby won't cry. We also had 63% in second place, a 6-month-old baby boy who's not had any attention or anything for 10 hours. And then the third scenario was a 4-year-old girl who's a mother who's suffering from depression and who's not bothered to feed her for 24 hours. So this kind of common theme in these 3 scenarios that were rated the most risky and the most children presenting vulnerability. And one of those common themes was very young children where the situation is completely out with their control. Those children completely dependent upon the adults and carers round about them. And you get some brief information about these children aren't safe in this scenario because the carers, the adults, either aren't able to provide care or aren't willing to provide care, or there's something going on that's preventing that care from being provided. So we see that common theme in those first 3 scenarios. Although interestingly, the one that just came forth, so the third scenario had 51% of you voting for it, exactly 50% of you voted for this scenario, a 15-year-old girl who has recently been befriended by a man who has persuaded her to do sexual things to him in exchange for money and affection. So we get a different set of characteristics here. We'll get a slightly older child, kind of 15 years old. So that's a bit different. But obviously, a high degree of concern. Half of all participants rated this as one of their top three. Now, there can be a lot of interest in, and at times contentious and special attitudes towards consent and sexuality, but straight away here we're saying it's a 15-year-old with an older man. Now, we'll never know, but if we represented as a 15-year-old girl and didn't say with an older man, it was with a 16-year-old boy or a 17-year-old boy, I wonder if it would have rated 50%. So I think there's something here still about the fact that a man, an adult, and a kind of 15-year-old girl, and the fact has persuaded her to do sexual things to him. So we're getting a bit here that there's a kind of control and power issue at play, and again that highlighting issues of risk and vulnerability. Now, there might be some of you who are actually surprised that that scenario only gathered 50% of the vote. Some of you might be kind of rating that kind of far more. And then we've got a range of other scenarios which all gathered some votes, some of them very few, some of them a bit more than others. And if you were all able to be in a room together, it'd be a big room, we've got that many participants, but if you could all talk to each other about this, there might be some interesting discussions, because my guess is there could be some scenarios that have got a few votes that some people might think, I'm not sure there's real risk and vulnerability there in the first instance. So you can think about the scenario, a 7-year-old girl who has her father regularly sleeping in bed with her. Now that's got 11% of the vote. But back to this issue, but we would need to know more. We would need more information in order for us to make a kind of clear assessment. But there could be a huge number of explanations for that scenario that wouldn't involve risk and vulnerability. Yet 11% of you voted it as one of your top three, and voted that in front of the tiny baby, the 6-month-old baby, the 4-year-old, all potentially very risky and vulnerable. Yet 11% of you thought that the 7-year-old sleeping in bed with their dad in some instances was an issue. So I guess what this exercise does, if nothing else, and that's why we do it in week 1, is to just begin to encourage people to tease out and explore, how do you begin to think about and define risk and vulnerability when it comes to children, and thinking about of different ages and different scenarios. Do we see some situations as risky or more vulnerable than others? And clearly the evidence of the poll here is that you do, because we've got kind of quite a variety of answers coming to us via the poll. So thanks for taking the time to vote. If you haven't done so already, go back into week 1 and look at the poll and look at the results for yourself, and you can still post comments and keep the discussion going in relation to the scenarios there. I want to move on to a kind of slightly, well, it's a related talk, so we just focus in week 2. We began to think about the issue of risk and risk aversion. You saw a video input from myself, a talk where I was talking about issues of risk and asking the question, are we in some occasions risk averse at the cost of developing risk competence in children and young people? And do we sometimes get ourselves into a situation where we don't allow children to experience any sort of risk, and that could potentially have a detrimental impact upon their development? I'm just going to pause for a second and take a drink of water here. No, that's one of the other advantages when there's 2 of you. You always get a break and you're not talking non-stop. Thanks. Now, looking at the comments on that page, that topic generated kind of a huge amount of discussion about this issue of risk aversion, and there was quite a lot of interesting comments kind of saying, I never really thought of the notion of the fact that children actually need to be exposed to some sort of risk in order that they learn how to cope with it. And I guess I would make the suggestion that parents and carers naturally expose children to risk from a very young age, but we try to do it in a controlled and manageable manner. And because we allow children, thinking about scenarios of encouraging children to learn a bike, to learn to bike for the first time, you've got to run the risk of them falling off and potentially injuring themselves. And now, some parents, we can knee pads, elbow pads, helmets, kind of all different sorts of things. We can start with stabilisers. We've all seen videos, or you might have been involved in scenarios where the adult running alongside or behind the child in the first instances, we kind of try to provide that safety net. But that's but one example. And then as children grow older, parents are consistently making decisions about how do they what do they let their children do and not, so in terms of kind of where they let them go, who they go out with, the activities that they allow them to do. And I guess good perhaps is the wrong words. Parents are kind of consistently involved in that process, will be thinking about and evaluating kind of what feels appropriate or not, so that we don't stifle the development of children, but equally we don't set them up to fail or get themselves into kind of dangerous situations. And so bring back to this issue about are we risk aversion, and we got some really interesting comments on that page. I printed a few out here so that I could make reference to them. So a comment here from Fiona Range. Thanks for making the comment, Fiona. She was talking about the fact that kind of life in itself is risky, and she kind of cited a couple of examples. You could say, kind of crossing the road is risky in a sense. But she said, I'm looking forward to learn and discuss what is considered good risk as opposed to bad risk in different countries and cultures. And I don't know if we'll talk about good risk and risk. I think what we definitely, as we go through the next 4 weeks of the course, what we definitely will be talking about is different attitudes towards what is acceptable or manageable risk. But I think what you're absolutely right to highlight, Fiona, is that there are contextual differences, countries and cultures. What is the norm in societies in certain settings will differ kind of from place to place, and that's not a constant either. So, if the example of Scotland, going back to Yin Yan's question at the beginning, it wasn't that long ago in our history. We only need to go back about 100 or 150 years, where children were regularly employed working in factories. They were employed as chimney sweeps, etc. They were employed as a kind of cheap commodities of labour. Now, society has changed, and attitudes towards children and childhood have changed. And most crucially within that, attitudes about acceptable and unacceptable risk for children have changed. So within our society, in a relatively short space of time, we've seen that move on. But there is by no means a consistent approach to this worldwide. And what is the norm in Scotland in terms of, if there is a norm, because it's a very contested issue, but within that spectrum, what is accepted within Scotland is by no means consistent with other parts of the world. There'll be other countries and other territories where children are far more regularly in employment. They far more regularly have caring roles for both older adults and for younger siblings, and so much so that their ability to engage in education can be seriously compromised. Now, those sorts of scenarios within a Scottish or a UK context would be identified as very significant risk factors, and people would be asking questions and asking if that was appropriate in the lives of those children and young people. But in some other settings in the world, that might be much more the norm. So thanks for that comment, Fiona, and I think it's really relevant to highlight the fact that perceptions of risk and what is acceptable or not acceptable risk will vary from setting to setting. But I think it'd be also important to say that there's no clear definition that can be associated necessarily with Scotland as opposed to associated with a different part of the world, because we're talking about spectrums of opinion here. So I'm just going to take a drink of water again. We had another couple of interesting comments on this same same topic of risk aversion. And Karen Mosley, again, Karen, thanks for your comment. And I thought you made a really nice comment, kind of picking out kind of some of the, not just the complexity, but you can almost say kind of slight kind of double standards about kind of some of this exists, because you highlight and especially the role of the media in this, and there was some material in the course already thinking about the role of the media and attitudes to risk. And you said, you made the comment that the media often are kind of very quick to condone when children are felt to have suffered because they've been left too risky a situation, but equally the role they can play. And you said that the media have done both a positive job in highlighting the plight of vulnerable children, but they too often take a rather perverse delight in the horrors of the case and look for simple answers. And linking that comment you make there about simple answers to my response to Fiona's comment about this is that there are no simple answers to this. And I think you're right, Karen, to highlight the fact that sometimes very complex and challenging situations in terms of how they might get responded to and reported within the media don't always come close to doing justice to the complexity of the job that different workers, carers, health professionals, education staff have, the challenge they have in responding to some of those situations. So thanks for making that comment. One last comment on this topic. Estelle Page made a comment also, so thanks for your comment, Estelle. Now you didn't actually say where you just said that you're talking about your home country, but you're not going to name your home country. And the reason that you didn't do that is you've been kind of slightly critical of it, and you said that there are not enough qualified professionals and field workers to support families and children in need. And I think that's a really important point, in linking that back to Yin Yan's question at the beginning about the fact that we're just encouraging you to think about what are services like, what are kind of how are attitudes constructed about the vulnerable children and the care and protection that they require, and how is that supported or not by the services that are put in place. And Estelle, you make the evaluation that you're saying you think a lot of children, young people suffer hardship because of bureaucracy and unnecessary red tape, and that's always something that we've got to guard against and challenge. So thanks for making for making your comment. Other thing I wanted to touch on this week was story. We're now 2 weeks into Billy's story, so you've begun to get a sense of some of the things that are happening for Billy and his mum. As is always the case, Billy's story generates probably more comments on this course than any other learning object. Also generates, I kind of think, more passion and identification with the story, because kind of people see a real person in Billy. So again, just to stress that Billy in that sense isn't a real person. The film was created by actors, but the circumstances that Billy and his family in are real, in that they are very typical of many families living in Scotland, UK, and I guess elsewhere also. So the issues that we explore via Billy's story are very real. And we've asked you a variety of questions about Billy's story today. We asked about kind of the theme of relationships in week 2. We also just asked for initial reactions to Billy's story in week 1, and also the notion of what did you feel that Billy was living in a containing environment. As I say, more comments on this than any other learning object. pardon me. One of the themes coming out of your comments was about the impact on his relationship with his mum of the circumstances that he was experiencing, and particularly thinking about mum's own needs and mum's mental health issues. I guess in looking at the comments, if I was surprised about anything, I was possibly surprised at the lack of mention of the need of supports for mum. Now, that's not to say there weren't any comments about that, there were, but in looking through a lot of the comments, I thought there was a lot of kind of people stating mum isn't always able to meet Billy's needs, and Billy often seems to have to be taking on a carer role for his mum, and that's all kind of completely valid. But I was possibly surprised that not as many people were flagging up the fact that perhaps if we want to truly help and support Billy, one of the best ways to achieve that is to think about supporting mum, because mum is his primary caregiver. There's lots of people commenting on in the first 2 weeks, feeling already strong evidence of a strong, good relationship between mum and his Billy. Lots of participants making links between the input she had from Laura this week on attachment, from Laura and Judy this week on attachment and containment and child development, and people able to identify the positive things going on between mum and Billy despite the difficult circumstances that mum is experiencing. So I was perhaps surprised that not more people were picking up on this theme of best way to support Billy, or one of the most significant ways to support Billy might be to support mum. On the other hand, what a lot of you were very keen to point out was the fact that you saw a new figure introduced in week 2, Mr. Merton, the guidance teacher, and the potential positive influence of this. And you also picked up on the fact that it was perhaps nice to see another main there, because it didn't look as if that Billy's relationship with his dad was giving him all that we might hope for. So the emergence of Mr. Merton being a positive influence. A number of you began to make comments about, well, perhaps some of the things that could be helpful for Billy would be a greater social circle, or kind of other things for him to be involved in. You were talking about potential clubs, support groups, friends, etc. So without giving too much away, that might be something that comes up in Billy's story as week goes on. Just want to pick up a couple of questions that I was asked specifically via the Google Hangout bar about Billy's story. Claire Burnett, thanks for your question, Claire. She said it would be interesting to know if Billy is known to social services due to his own circumstances. Now, I'm going to not answer that, because I don't want to give any spoilers away in terms of what happens in future weeks. But I do want to raise the question of, or just highlight the point that certainly in the UK context, social services and social work have arguably never been under more pressure in terms of funding cuts and cuts to resources. And linking this to the earlier discussion about risk and kind of risk averseness, that certain kind of in terms of kind of cases that will have profile, I think it would be fair to say that it's not saying for a second that Billy doesn't need, but in the grand scheme of kind of what's happening, Billy's case at this stage, in terms of the information that you have seen for the first 2 weeks of the story, would struggle to compete with other cases which social workers and social services will be having to manage in terms of real immediate risk. And it's comparing this, if we go back to the 10 scenarios that we presented you to with, and whilst you don't have all the information, think about comparing Billy and what you know about him to the tiny baby being given the shaking, or the 6-month-old boy who's not getting any attention or food for 10 hours, or the 4-year-old girl whose mother's suffering from depression, no attention or food for the last 24 hours. These are all the sorts of scenarios that are happening up and down the country. So whilst there's lots of Billies out there, there's also lots of these other children as well. And social services and social workers only have so many resources, and they've got choices to make all the time. So Claire, and answer your question about will it be known to social services? Well, you'll find out about that as time goes on. But I guess make the point that even if he is known, where would he be on the priority list for resources? Well, on the basis of what we've had so far, sadly for Billy, now this is not to say that he doesn't need, but for Billy, he might struggle to register when compared to these other sorts of cases. Also had another question from Lisa Scully, so thanks for your question, Lisa. And she asked the question, is Billy in danger of, we saying, developing a mental illness that is caused by abandonment? And you say, if so, what interventions could be used to prevent that, or is it too late? So you got a couple of questions within there. It's interesting, you word abandonment. I don't know if that's perhaps a bit feels a bit harsh or a bit severe for certainly for Billy's mum. I'm not so much sure that he's been abandoned. Mum has a particular set of needs and circumstances, and we've already seen evidence that when mum's in a good place, then mum's able to offer Billy very good care. It's when mum's mental health difficulties become more prominent that she struggles. So whether that's abandonment, I'm not sure. I think that's possibly something else. But I think the question about is Billy in danger of developing a mental illness? Well, Billy's certainly, I think, not in the perfect care circumstances that we would like for him. Whether it runs a particular risk of a mental illness, I don't know. There could be so many factors at play that could cause that to be the case. But in terms of asking the question, is it too late? I'd say absolutely not. In terms of what we've seen for the first two weeks of the story so far, that Billy's scenario and kind of Billy's family is, but by no means there's no too late for any sort of intervention support that would be helpful for them. But thanks for your question, Lisa. We have some kind of some other interesting comments in relation to Billy's story. Andrew Burrows made a comment. Thanks for posting your comment, Andrew. And you highlighted something that I thought was really interesting, because you were talking particularly about what you saw as attachment difficulties. But what I thought was really interesting was you highlighted the fact that he was having to look after himself for long periods of time. He said Billy and his mother obviously care about each other, but it's like the roles have been reversed and Billy is the main caregiver. And that's a really important point. It's something that we will explore in a bit more detail in further weeks. There are many kind of certainly in a UK context, kind of many kind of children and young people that have to take on caring roles at a very young age, or a younger age than would be the norm within our society, and that can create a whole range of challenges for them in terms of how we help them cope with that, how we help them support that. But again, we can link that back to two strands of the earlier discussion. One is in terms of reading about this in Scotland, but in many other cultures, a child of Billy's age having caring roles such as this would not be out of the ordinary at all. So what we might view as a risky or vulnerable situation might not necessarily be viewed risky or vulnerable somewhere else. So that's an interesting comparison. Another issue is that we can view Billy's caring role as a risk, as a concern, but what we also know is that, and despite these kind of difficulties and risks and concerns that can be presented by having to take on a caring role when you're young, young people in that situation can often derive kind of some sort of kind of strength and comfort from it, and simply rip them out of it and take that away from them might not necessarily be the best response. It's kind of far more kind of complicated and nuanced than that. So we will think about this more in a couple of weeks, but I would encourage people to think about this consistently as we follow Billy's story through the 6 weeks. There's for Billy or any other children that we're working with, there's very rarely a match fund type response in terms of how we're going to make everything better for them. So kind of thinking about what might be the best way to actually support Billy within this scenario. One last comment before we finish, and that's from Karen Petit. So thanks for posting your question, Karen. You made a comment that I think a lot of people kind of empathise with. You started just by talking about how hard it must be for Billy in terms of him feeling sad for his mum feeling sad, and recognising the fact that mum has a very loving, caring side, and she wants to protect, and he wants to protect his mum from more upset. And linked to Andrew's point about that kind of caregiving role, it's not necessarily, I think, about how do we shouldn't be thinking about blaming anybody in this situation. We shouldn't necessarily even be thinking about plucking Billy out of this situation, but it's about how we support Billy and his mum to be better able to meet Billy's care needs, but allowing Billy still to access and participate in what is the most significant and caring and loving relationship for him, which is his relationship with his mum. So thanks for your comments, Karen. Got a couple of minutes just before we finish on the Google Hangout bar. I did have a kind of couple of just other kind of quick comments that I was going to respond to. Yinya, I already responded to one of your questions. You said something about, are we going to get more about relationship-based interventions? Yes, the short answer to that. When we come on to some of the material in future weeks, we'll think about different models of practice, and some of the material that we'll be looking at will be very much focused on a more relationship-based way of working. And also we had another comment from, pardon me, Fee Strathd. Strathd is a very good name to her, kind of quite nearly Strathclyde. So thanks for your question, Fee. And you were highlighting the importance of being able to talk to and communicate with the people that we're working with, and allowing them to express their own views about parenting, childhood issues, anxieties, etc. I see that being quite linked to the question that Yan just asked about relationship-based interventions. So it's to very much stress that in future weeks, especially in weeks 4 and 5, we will think about different approaches that consider some of these things. But we've just about got to the end of our time, so my voice has held up, so I'm pleased about that. I hope that the Hangout has been useful and interesting, and helped you to think further about some of the concepts and issues that we've been dealing with over the first 2 weeks. Please continue to engage. If you get any responses to anything that I've said in the Google Hangout, then go onto the Google Hangout page and post comments at the bottom, and let's get a conversation going. As I said, none of this is an exact science. Some of you may agree with some of the things that I've been saying, but some of you may have different takes and different views on some of the things I've been saying, and it would be good to have that discussion. And look forward to your participation, and I'll see you again in 2 weeks' time for the next Google Hangout then. Thanks.
Thank you, Graham, and thank you to everyone who participated in the Hangout today. As Graham said, the next Google Hangouts will take place in weeks 4 and in week 6. From all of us here in Glasgow, thank you and goodbye.